አዲስ ቅኝት መቀመጫውን በቶሮንቶ ያደረገ የመረጃና የመዝናኛ ሬዲዮና ፖድካስት ነው። አዲስ ቅኝትን አዳምጡ፣ በአዲስ ቅኝት ተናገሩ።
I grew up in Canada, shrouded in my family's collective silence, and raised by my Canadian mother. It wasn't until my late 30s that I moved to AddisAbaba so that I could better understand the country that is in my blood and build a relationship with my father's sisters. At my grandmother's house, I was confronted with a new revelation. I had another aunt, one that no one had ever mentioned.
Sally had disappeared. We don't know where she was. We don't know if she was alive.
I would like to say congratulations on your successful premiere on Hot Docs International Film Festival this year, virtually. And tell me, who is Tamra and where do you born and how do you grow up? What did you study? Let's start with this question first.
Okay, sure. So I grew up in Ottawa, Canada, mostly with my mother, and then seeing my father and his family less frequently because my parents divorced. And I went to study in Toronto, and I studied management for the music industry. And my career has been a real mix of different things. I have worked in the music industry on and off. I worked as well in theater. I ran a multi-arts youth production company for nearly a decade, producing theater, music, and film content. But then I've also worked periodically in international, doing communications and youth programming. But I think the thing that has tied together, you know, all of the work I've done is really my interest in telling stories, and also telling stories from the perspectives of women, from the perspectives of people of color, who we often don't get to hear their stories on an international stage. So whether it was writing a press release about returnees in South Sudan, or you know, doing something like this project now on my aunt and the revolution in Ethiopia, it was always, I think, been about producing content that gives a voice to some of the stories we otherwise often overlook.
That's really wonderful. You produce plays too, on stage.
On stage, I mean, I did work very briefly for a company in Toronto called Obsidian, and Obsidian is, I think, probably the first and also likely the largest Black theatre company in Canada. And that was something I did right after school, and it was an internship designed to help, I think it was producers, to help enter the world of theatre, because as you may know, the theatre industry in Canada is very, very white, and the large production companies until recently are mostly headed up by white staff, and you know, a lot of the content then that ends up being produced when the leadership are white is content that reflects that point of view. But the work that the 411 initiative produced was multi-arts theater productions that actually went into high schools. So that's a company I ran for over 10 years, and we went into somewhere between 500 to 700 high schools across Canada with educational arts programming looking at social justice issues.
That's very interesting. So do you think these skills and experiences in your documentary filmmaking?
I mean, I think certainly, because, I mean, going to school for music management was really, you know, it doesn't matter if I'm managing a musical tour or musical album production or a dance production or theater or film. It's sort of all the same process in terms of looking at how do you produce, market, and distribute arts content. So I think it all was sort of, you know, leading into what I'm doing now, which is primarily just film.
Okay, so how do you get into the documentary filmmaking platform, and you know, when did you start your first documentary in Canada?
The first documentary I worked on was back in 2007, and that was a short film project that was shot in Haiti. And that was something that came out of my work in the international development sector. Both of the first two films I produced were related to work I was doing for an NGO called Plan International.
Oh, That's interesting. So let's come to your latest films, Finding Sally. It's a success in Canada and internationally. So what was the motive for your latest film?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me the motivation was I think twofold. One, I really love history, and I've always wanted to make a film about what happened during the 1970s, and specifically, about the Red Terror. But that's more of, a large topic, and I feel that for a film to be successful, you have to have a strong and compelling story that you want to tell. So it was something I wanted to do, but had never explored because I didn't know what was the personal story angle that I could bring to that project. And it was really then when I found out about Sally and the fact that she had been involved in so many key moments, I guess, in Ethiopian history in the 1970s. And I realized that there was so much pain tied to remembering her. That's why my family had never told me about her. So that gave me, I think, the story element to then do a film about the Red Terror through my investigation of Sally and who she was.
Oh, Sally's story was a secret in the family when you grew up?
I mean, I never learned anything about Sally until I turned around 30. That's when I found out.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I've noticed through reflecting in the process of making this film was really that my father never spoke to me at all about his childhood or anything to do with that. So most of the information I got was from his sisters, my aunts, and they tended to talk to me about the things that happened to them when they were children and teenagers, or the things that happened to my grandparents or my great-grandparents during, the Italian occupation. So it was almost like all of these great and grand or heroic memories, but then once 1974 hit, there's sort of like a brick wall in the family consciousness. And of course, that's because, things that happened after the revolution were painful, and there was a culture of fear around talking about them. So of course, now I realized that's why they weren't talking about this, and that's why I didn't know that Sally existed.
What's your family's involvement, during the Italian invasion in the 1930s? Were they part of the struggle in the country? I know your grandfather was a diplomat in Haile Selassie's regime in the empire. So we will talk about that later. But are they involved in the anti-fascist struggle?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot. Yeah, it's not something I've researched to look into heavily. But I mean, I know from some of the stories my grandmother has told me, because I interviewed my grandmother extensively before she passed away, or my other aunts, are really to do with my grandmother's parents. My great-grandfather had some sort of post in the imperial government through which he was dispatched to Sudan, and he was working in Sudan, I guess, as a go-between between the British and the emperor and some of the patriot fighters who were, I guess, in Sudan at that time. So I know that my grandmother and my great aunt grew up or were in Sudan during the occupation, and were involved in things like sewing, I believe, emblems for uniforms for the Ethiopian soldiers who then re-entered Ethiopia with the British. But it's not something that I know a lot about. It's just sort of those, little tidbits to understand, I guess, what and where people were during that time in my family. I know that my great-grandfather, his memoirs were recently published, but they were published in Amharic and they haven't yet been translated. So once they're translated, I'll be able to read his memoir, have a much greater understanding about his involvement then, and also, I think, what he was thinking.
That's very interesting. I ask you this question because Sally was born and grew up in Canada, but she was very determined and very courageous to go to Ethiopia and to fight for others. Though she was a communist, but she was dedicated for what she believed in. So maybe that kind of heroic deed came from her past, or her, I don't know, maybe from her ancestors. I thought it was related with her past. Do you think,
I think
that's true?
It certainly could be. I mean, one thing to clarify, none of my Sally or none of her siblings were born in Canada. They only moved to Canada in 1968, and they grew up living mostly in Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan before coming to Canada. So, I mean, Ethiopia was not a place they had been to, that often. But it was, because they grew up in an embassy household, Ethiopia was a place that they knew they were from and a culture that they respected and were deeply connected to. So I think there's that could have been a driving force for her. I think that certainly because my grandfather was a diplomat, she was always raised being around politics, being around, living in Africa in the 1960s, being around and influenced potentially by so many liberation movements that were happening across the continent. And then I think also being re-immersed in this culture of democracy, of people advocating for their rights when she arrived to Canada, because this is, in the middle of the Vietnam War. She was joining protests in Canada against the Chinese occupation of Tibet to do with apartheid in South Africa. So I think it was something that was, very much, it was just perhaps the opportunity of going to Ethiopia and seeing the impacts of inequality firsthand in front of her there that perhaps, drove her to say, I want to do something to change what's happening in my country.
As a young, filmmaker and as a young person, grow up in contemporary time, what's your thought about communism and the young generation who pay their life during the 1960s revolutions here and there in the world?
I think, communism in literature, the idea on paper sound really wonderful, and sounds to me like quite logical. But I think, where we've always failed, and it's not, just Ethiopia, is often in the implementation of it. So I don't know that we can point to a country that's been, 100% successful in reaching this idea of a communist utopia. But I do think that from reading, I spent a lot of time in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., going through old EPRP and Mason and other student activist writings. And I think, a lot of the ideas and ideals that they were dreaming of for Ethiopia are still very relevant today. I mean, one of the things that really stuck out to me was the idea of equality and, having a classless society, having equality and not having any divisions based on race. And I think that those are exactly the divisions that are dividing Ethiopia today. So I do think that there's, some things that may not be applicable now, 40 years later, but certainly some things in those ideologies that could still for us to learn from and discuss and consider.
Yeah, that in Ethiopia, when communism was applied, there were so many factions and there were so many groups who claimed to be the best Marxist or the best communist. So that was, some people say that was the reason for them to fight among themselves instead of, bringing the dictatorship of proletariats as Marx. What was the reason fighting among themselves in your research?
I mean, that's not something I really focused maybe a lot of time and energy on in my research, because I knew that it wasn't something that was really going to land in the film, that the film, would have been much too complex for an international television viewing audience if I started to try and explain the differences or the difference in opinions and ideology between the EPRP and Mason, or the later splits between the EPRP leadership. I mean, to me, that didn't seem like the most important thing to focus on. I think the more important thing to focus on is the fact that so many young people gave their lives and took such great risks to fight for a future in their country and to fight for what they believe to be a better Ethiopia. So I don't know that I'm, the best person to be able to answer that question as well.
Okay, and I can understand because you are not part of that generation, but I want to know what you learned in your research. Anyway, let's jump to another question. Is it easy to tell this kind of story for international communities that have no idea what's happening in Ethiopia back then?
No, I mean, I think it's certainly challenging because on the one hand, depending on where you've received your financing for your film and what broadcasters are on board, you have certain responsibilities to the audiences connected to that funding. So for me, that was very much to Canada and Canadian audiences. So that means making a film that can explain some of the more complex historical points than you may be doing if your film only has an Ethiopian audience. So that means explaining, who was the emperor, who were the Derg, and what did that mean. So those, I think, are some of the nuances you have to do, because you do have to anticipate that your viewer may not know anything about the history and the time and the space that the story is taking place within.
How do you face that challenge for your broadcasters and audiences in Canada, and how do you overcome it?
I think with this film, I mean, a lot of the feedback that I've gotten both from white Canadians or non-Ethiopian audiences who don't know anything about Ethiopian history is that the way the film is structured with the archive material and the voiceover enabled them to understand about a time in Ethiopia that they know nothing about. And I've also gotten, similar comments from younger Ethiopians who don't know a lot about their own history. So people who are, let's say 25 and under. I think there is also a similar result in trying to help to simplify or at least streamline some of the key facts and key occurrences within the timeline that the film covers.
Do you use so many footage in the film, rare footage? How do you manage to get those footage? Were they in Ethiopia or in Canada?
Yes, so a lot of the footage, the archival footage, comes from EBC here in Ethiopia, from their archive. And then a little bit of the radio footage, I believe, comes from the CBC archive in Canada. And then the vast majority of the rest of the footage comes from European archives.
I know it's finding archival footage is not an easy task in Ethiopia. ABC's files are misplaced, and they were in 35 millimeter or other formats before. So some of them are not converted to digital archives. So was it easy to find those materials in the ABC archive?
No, I mean it certainly wasn't easy, and I think the only reason that it happened was because some of the staff there and the senior archive manager were very supportive of the project, and also because I was in Ethiopia for an extended trip. When I did most of that digging, I could spend days on end going through the footage there. But I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head to introduce a huge project that really needs to be undertaken in Ethiopia, and that is the proper digitization and digital restoration of the huge amount of history that's stored there, both in the TV and radio archives, because it's a part of our history, and it's important to have that so that it can be used and seen in the future.
How about other archives?
My family, I mean, because they were diplomats, there were a lot of official photos. Certainly also a lot of official photographs of my grandfather in all of the countries, including Canada, where he was an ambassador. And then, my family just had also tons of personal family photos. So that was, really helpful. And a lot of those are in the film. I think the only thing that, of course, we didn't have any archive, be it photo or video content of, was Sally after she went underground. Tell
me about your grandfather's diplomatic mission to Canada. I think he was the first ambassador to Canada. in 1968, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, that was when the first Ethiopian embassy was opened in Canada. It was right after and as a result of the Ethiopian pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal. So about a year later, my grandfather and the rest of the family moved to Ottawa to open that first embassy.
There was a very interesting picture in your film that mentioned the Trudeau, the father, and your grandfather meet, and you mentioned his opinion about his wife. And tell me about that experience a bit.
Well, I mean, I'm certain that they would have met multiple times because, I mean, the embassy was opened at the request of Trudeau Sr. To the Emperor. I think that specific incident you're referring to is at some sort of cocktail or dance that was held in Ottawa where Trudeau Sr. was, I guess, sort of flirting with my grandmother, and my grandfather didn't really take kindly to that.
So, okay, what kind of person your grandfather was?
I can only tell you what I've heard from other people because, I mean, he died when I was, I think, just as an early teenager. For most of, I was born in 1980, and, he was under house arrest or usually not able to leave Ethiopia for most of the Derg period. So I didn't really see him that frequently. And when I saw him towards the end of his life, he was sickly, and I don't remember, ever having had a full conversation with him. But of course, I've interviewed my relatives about him. And I think, he was a very educated man. He was a career diplomat. He was very dedicated to working for the Ethiopian government, regardless of which government was in power. And I know he also was an avid reader of the news and spoke many, many languages.
Addiskignit New Perspective.
አዲስቅኝት በብሪጅ ኢንተርቴይንመንት እየተዘጋጀ ዘወትር እሁድ ከ4 እስከ 6 ፒኤም በሬዲዮ ሬጀንት ላይ ይቀርባል። And let's come to Sally's story. What is it like finding her journey from Addis to Asimba, and how do you find the real truth that she was died in Asimba? Tell me about that process and the last moment of your character.
Well, I mean, I think the research was very interesting because it enables you to put a personal face or to put a person against the history. So even when I was reading books about the student movement or other people's memoirs about being in the EPRP, you always wonder if Sally was also there or if she was thinking or feeling the same sorts of things. So I think it makes the history much more personal. But I do think that, in relation to the content in the film, when you look at my aunts, they're each showing you or remembering the version of Sally, their sister, that they're comfortable to remember 40 years later. And that's part of the reason why I spent time in my research process talking to the other people who knew Sally outside of the family. So that means Tamras, and also villagers and clergy in Asimba who had encountered her and had memories in relation to her. And I felt that was necessary to go outside the family to be able to piece together, as much as we can into the collage of remembering who Sally was.
If I'm not wrong, in the film, people associated her with medical support.
Yeah, I mean, she was doing a number of things that I'm aware of when she was in Asimba. One of those was, I guess, sort of acting like a nurse to help and dispatch medical care. I mean, I remember when we were up there doing the first round of research, meeting a man and his elderly mother, and he had been a boy when Sally had been there, and he had some sort of head injury, and his mother had taken him to be bandaged up by her. So it's not that she was, a doctor. She didn't have medical training. It was sort of the provision of very basic first aid that would also be, of course, limited by the amount of supplies that they would have had access to there. And I know that she was also acting at some point in terms of helping to spread the ideology of the EPRP amongst the villagers, and that she also had acted as a public defender within the EPRP's tribunal processes as well.
How about her relation with Tsalota? I think he's one of the decision makers in the EPRP hierarchy. So do you know exactly where his position was, and what their relation looks like in the struggle?
I met when they were both teachers at the Nifas Silk school here in Addis. And that would have been probably in late 73, early 1974. And that they were married. They had a very small wedding because, of course, as communists, they didn't want to have a church wedding. They didn't want to have a big, fancy affair. And, I think it was also not common and perhaps not fondly looked upon for two members of their organization to have married each other. And in fact, many of Sally's comrades didn't know that they were married, that I've interviewed in the process of this film.
Being romantic in that kind of situation, what it looks like, from what you hear from their friends.
Well, what I think was very much in love. They were committed to each other as they were to the struggle. And I know one of the interesting stories I heard from some of the elders in Asimba, who helped me to locate the location of Sally's grave. And then, in fact, Salota's mother then repeated to me the same story, was that at Sally's funeral, Salota was quite distraught, and he wanted to throw himself into the grave after her. And the villagers told me that they thought this was, very strange, because why are you so upset about the death of your wife? You can just get another wife.
So you end it, by putting a statue at Asimba for Tsalota and your main character, Sally. So what's the implication of that statue? What do you want to show your audience or, the younger generation?
Well, I think it's twofold. It's one that my family needed to have a place to go and mourn because they had no marker on Sally's grave. As well, Salota's mother and my grandmother had both wanted to have headstones erected in the church compound, but that had never happened. So on the one hand, I think that was important to do for those reasons. But on the other hand, if you look closely at the stone that we put up, it's not only a grave marker for Sally and Salota, but it's really put up there as a memoriam to all the young people who died fighting in that region and who died, trying to bring about what they believe would be a more just Ethiopia. Because we know that there's many, many young people who died in that region and never had a proper burial or were not buried in a church.
Do you see yourself in Sally's personality? Do you have something in common?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some similarities between me and her in terms of interest in social justice and activism. I think, based on the times we're living, there are enacting those things through different ways. But I think, there's similarities between me and all of my aunts. There's a little bit of you that's in everyone, within your family. And then there's certainly things that we're also completely different about.
Was it your original plan to finish it this way, or you changed things in the process?
Well, on the one, it takes so long to make a film that you never know the time and space that you'll be in when you finish making the film. And, during production of the film was the 3 days mass strike in Ethiopia in February 2018, sorry. And then, the resignation of the former prime minister. So there was a great energy and spirited change happening while we were still in production. Abiy coming to power, people having this blind adoration and excitement for him, which is now, 2 years later, starting to wane. So it's hard sometimes to end a movie when the history you're talking about is constantly evolving. And I think on the other hand, going back to what we talked about here in terms of Canadian audiences, we have to think about how to explain to a Canadian audience what is the relevance and the impact of the Red Terror today, and what was the ultimate outcome for Mengistu and the Derg government. So there were sort of a lot of loose ends in terms of the historical thread that, can be challenging to try and tie up in a neat bow. But I also, really wanted to drive home the point and try and relate back to the energy of the young people in the 70s and the energy then of the young people, in the Oromo protests, which then, so many other people joined and took part in other regions, and to try and look for some parallels there.
If you would have recorded the last part of your film, do you think it would be different from what we saw?
So the final ending of the film was something that went in 6 months ago, 6 or 8 months ago. So it wasn't, that long ago. For me, the tone is still sort of the same. Yes, we have this new leader who seems to be saying all the right things, and people, including my aunts in their closing commentary, are feeling much more free and much more optimistic. But I think, for me, the message is, because we have this election coming, we don't know when, now that it's been postponed again, that is an opportunity to actually affect change, and that we should think critically about how that happens and how we participate and how we vote.
The last thing, what's your response from international filmmakers, from Hot Dogs or from CBC and Canadian audience? And tell me about that a little bit.
I don't have an official response. The film was just broadcast maybe 4 or 5 days ago. So most of the responses I've gotten to the film are overwhelmingly from the Ethiopian Eritrean community, saying that they, appreciate being able to see this history told in this manner. That a lot of people telling me that they've decided to have a conversation with their children about their memories with that period, or from younger people writing in to say, they're talking now to their parents or their grandparents because they want to understand more about what happened to their own family. Yeah. And I think, from non-Ethiopian audiences, people have just been really interested to learn about something that they knew nothing about.
Thank you very much for your time and for your interesting conversation with Newperspective Radio here in Toronto. And if you have anything to add, anything to say, let me give you last chance.
Yeah, I would say, the only other thing that I'm working on right now during this lockdown is, because I would like to do a larger impact campaign around the film. So I'm beginning to formulate that, and also to look for money, because I feel like there are so many stories to do with the revolution and the Red Terror that we don't have as archives through a video format. So I really want to go around with the screenings of the film and collect the short video memories of other people, either, their own experiences, or to document what happened to their friends and relatives. And it's something that I want to do, and then be able to donate to the Red Terror Museum here in Addis, because I feel like it's a missing piece of their archive for us to have that sort of large collection of video memories.
Thank you very much, Tamra. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you so much.
አዲስ ቅኝት መቀመጫውን በቶሮንቶ ያደረገ የመረጃና የመዝናኛ ሬዲዮና ፖድካስት ነው። አዲስ ቅኝትን አዳምጡ፣ በአዲስ ቅኝት ተናገሩ።